Berlin, November 1923. A woman leaves a bakery carrying a wicker basket stuffed to the brim with paper banknotes. Not the food she came for, just the money required to buy it. She's forgotten the basket for a moment, distracted, and when she turns back, someone has stolen it. But not the money inside. Whoever took it dumped the worthless banknotes on the pavement and walked off with the empty basket instead. That basket was worth more than the pile of cash sitting on the ground beside it. This is not an exaggeration invented for a documentary. It is one of dozens of stories that actually circulated in Germany during one of the most extreme currency collapses in modern history. And at the center of it all sat a printing press that never seemed to stop running. To understand how a modern, industrialized nation ended up in a situation where wheelbarrows were more valuable than the cash piled inside them, we have to start at the end of the First World War. Germany surrendered in November 1918. Exhausted and financially gutted after 4 years of fighting a war it had largely financed not through taxes, but through borrowing, issuing war bonds to its own citizens and printing money to cover the rest, on the confident assumption that Germany would win and make the losers pay for everything afterward. Germany lost. And in 1919, the Treaty of Versailles handed the new German government a bill nobody in Berlin was prepared to pay. Reparations, an enormous sum owed to the victorious Allied powers, intended to cover the cost of the war Germany had just lost. The new government, a fragile young democracy known as the Weimar Republic, named for the town where its constitution was drafted, inherited both this massive foreign debt and a mountain of wartime domestic debt. At the exact moment its economy was at its weakest, its factories converting slowly back from weapons to peacetime goods, and its population exhausted, hungry, and deeply resentful. The man tasked with managing Germany's currency through this crisis was Rudolf Havenstein, president of the Reichsbank, the country's central bank. Havenstein was, by every account, a careful, traditionally minded central banker, not a reckless gambler, not a con artist. He genuinely believed that keeping German industry running, keeping workers employed, and keeping the government funded during an existential political crisis mattered more than strict adherence to old monetary orthodoxy. And so, when the government came to him needing money it didn't have, to pay reparations, to pay wages, to pay for basic government functions, Havenstein did what central bankers before him had occasionally done in smaller crises. He printed more. At first, this seemed to work, in the way that borrowing against a future paycheck always seems to work at the very beginning. Prices rose, but not catastrophically. German exports, priced in a weakening currency, actually became more competitive abroad for a while. But the underlying problem never went away. Germany's expenses, driven largely by reparations demanded in foreign currency, kept exceeding what its shattered economy could actually produce and tax. And the government's answer to that gap, again and again, was the same lever Havenstein kept pulling: print more paper marks. By 1921 and 1922, the mark's value against foreign currencies like the US dollar was sliding steadily, uncomfortably, but the real breaking point arrived in January 1923. Germany fell behind on reparations deliveries, timber and coal shipments owed to France, and in response, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland, to seize the resources directly. The German government's response was to call for passive resistance. Workers and factory owners in the Ruhr were told to stop producing entirely rather than let their labor benefit the occupying forces. It was a bold act of national defiance. It was also a financial catastrophe. The government kept paying wages and compensation to the striking Ruhr workers and businesses to keep the resistance alive. Money it once again did not have, and once again chose to print rather than tax. This was the moment the currency crisis stopped being a slow decline and became something closer to a free fall. From that point forward, the printing presses at the Reichsbank ran, quite literally, around the clock, at more than 100 paper mills and dozens of printing firms, working non-stop just to produce enough banknotes to keep pace with prices that were now changing not month to month, but hour to hour. The human details of what followed are almost impossible to overstate. Workers began demanding to be paid twice a day, at midday and again at the end of their shift, because waiting until the next morning meant the money would already have lost a meaningful chunk of its value. The moment wages were paid, families would sprint, literally run, to the nearest shop to convert cash into anything physical before prices rose again within hours. Shopkeepers changed their prices multiple times a day, sometimes chalking new numbers on boards every couple of hours as the exchange rate against the dollar collapsed further. Restaurants stopped printing menus with fixed prices altogether, because a price printed at the start of a meal might be laughably outdated by the time the bill arrived. People were reported paying for a single cup of coffee, only to find that a second cup, ordered minutes later, cost noticeably more. Life savings that had taken families a generation to build, money set aside in bank accounts for retirement, for a child's future, for a modest inheritance, became worthless within months. A pension that had comfortably supported an elderly couple in 1921 might not cover a single loaf of bread by late 1923. This wasn't a minority experience. It touched nearly every household in the country that depended on cash savings rather than physical property. The numbers involved reached a scale that's genuinely difficult for the human mind to process. In January 1923, $1 was worth roughly 18,000 German marks. By November of that same year, $1 was worth over 4 trillion marks. Banknotes were printed in denominations of 50 billion marks, then 100 billion, with printers eventually giving up on printing new numbers altogether, and simply stamping additional zeros onto older bills to save time. Photographs from the period, now famous, show German children building toy towers out of stacks of banknotes, or families using worthless paper currency as kindling to heat their homes, because burning the cash for warmth was, by that point, more useful than trying to spend it. The wheelbarrow image that so many people associate with this crisis wasn't exaggeration or metaphor, it was simply logistics. When workers were paid, the sheer physical volume of banknotes required to cover even a modest weekly wage became so enormous that wheelbarrows, laundry baskets, and suitcases became the only practical way to carry it home. And this is precisely the origin of the theft story we opened with. Thieves who stole the cart, or the basket, and dumped the money were making, in a strange way, a rational economic calculation. The container was worth more than the currency piled inside it. Not everyone suffered equally, and that unevenness left scars that would matter enormously for what came next. People who owed debts, mortgages, business loans, found those debts effectively evaporating, because a fixed sum, borrowed in 1920, became almost meaningless to repay in the collapsed currency of 1923. Some savvy businessmen and speculators borrowed heavily specifically to take advantage of this, buying property and factories with loans they knew would soon be worth almost nothing to repay. Meanwhile, the vast German middle class, teachers, civil servants, pensioners, small savers, who had done everything considered financially responsible, watched their careful, conservative savings get wiped out entirely, while some debtors and speculators walked away wealthier than before. This divide, between those wiped out and those who profited from the chaos, poisoned German society's trust in its own institutions for years afterward. The hyperinflation of 1923 became, and remains, a defining trauma in German collective memory, one that historians still point to when explaining why German economic policy, for the rest of the 20th century, would remain almost fanatically cautious about inflation, decades after the crisis itself had ended. The collapse finally reached its breaking point in November 1923, and the fix, when it finally came, wasn't gradual, it was a single, dramatic act of currency surgery. Rudolf Havenstein died suddenly on November 20, 1923, still presiding over a currency in freefall. His successor, a sharp, unconventional financier named Hjalmar Schacht, introduced an entirely new currency called the Rentenmark, backed not by gold, which Germany didn't have enough of, but by a legal claim on the nation's land and industrial assets, a clever fiction, in some ways, but one that worked because the government paired it with something Havenstein had never been willing to do, a hard, absolute limit on how much new currency could be printed, alongside real cuts to government spending. Almost overnight, the psychological spell broke. One new Rentenmark was set equal to 1 trillion of the old, worthless paper marks. Prices stabilized within weeks. The wheelbarrows disappeared from the streets. It remains one of the fastest, most dramatic monetary stabilizations in modern economic history. Proof that hyperinflation, once truly out of control, is often less a slow economic illness than a crisis of belief. One that can end almost as suddenly as it began. The moment people believe the printing has genuinely, credibly stopped. But stabilizing the currency didn't undo the damage already done to an entire generation's trust and savings. Millions of Germans who had lost everything they'd worked their whole lives to save carried a bitter permanent resentment toward the young Weimar democracy that had presided over their ruin, even though, in fairness, much of the underlying crisis had roots stretching back to wartime borrowing under the previous imperial government, not the republic itself. That distinction mattered far less than the lived experience of watching a lifetime of careful saving become worthless within months. Historians continue to debate exactly how directly the trauma of 1923 fed into the political extremism that would consume Germany within the following decade, but few dispute that a population this thoroughly burned by its own currency was left dangerously receptive to anyone promising order, stability, and someone to blame. Strip away the wheelbarrows and the trillion-mark banknotes, and the underlying mechanism here is almost painfully simple and painfully familiar. A government faces bills it cannot cover through taxation or trade. Rather than making the hard, unpopular choice to cut spending or raise taxes, it reaches for the printing press instead, a choice that feels, in the moment, less politically painful than the alternative. And it keeps reaching for that same lever, again and again, because each individual decision to print a little more always looks smaller and more survivable than the accumulated consequence of doing it dozens of times in a row. Rudolf Havenstein wasn't a villain twirling a mustache. He was a cautious man making what felt, at each individual moment, like the least bad available choice, right up until those choices compounded into one of the most complete currency collapses the modern world has ever recorded. So here's a question worth sitting with. If you were running a country's printing press, and every single decision to print a little more felt individually reasonable, individually necessary, at what exact point would you have had the courage to stop? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want another story where money, power, and collapse collide, subscribe. There's another currency, another crisis, and another lesson waiting in the next video.